Hello and welcome everyone to our special July with Misa seminar. My name is Alanis and I'm joined today by Lorna, and together we will be hosting today's PhD showcase. I begin today by acknowledging the traditional owners of the land in which I am today, the Wurundjeri and Bunurong people of the Kulin Nation, and recognise their continuing connection to the land. And as WMISA is an international organisation, we also pay our respects to the Maori as Tangata Whenua of Aotearoa, New Zealand. We pay our respects to their elders, past, present and emerging, and extend this to all Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people. Indigenous peoples were the first Australian and New Zealand earth and environmental scientists, and we have a lot to learn from their deep knowledge that spans tens of thousands of years. So today, things will be running slightly differently to our normal seminar series. The PhD Showcase is an opportunity for us to highlight some of the amazing work that our PhD students are doing in earth and environmental science around Australasia. Today, we will be hearing from three fantastic PhD students. They will each be speaking for roughly 15 minutes, and then there will be an opportunity to ask questions. So please write them in the chat or unmute yourself when it is question time. All the recordings of past seminars and this seminar are available on our website. All right, First one's up. I'm delighted to introduce our first speaker, Rachel Kirby. Rachel is a student at the Australian National University, and her talk today is titled Forged in Fire, the Formation, Cooling History and Age of Impacts on the IIE Iron Parent Body. Welcome, Rachel.
Thank you. All right, let's get this shared. You can all see that okay?
Yep, looks great.
Brilliant. Hi, so my name's Rachel, as Alana said, and even though this is an earth and environmental science group, I don't study the earth, I study rocks from space. So I did do geology for my undergraduate, and that led me into geology of other planetary bodies. So I'm going to be talking today about how we think the 2E iron parent body formed. Oh, sorry, there we go. Okay, just a bit of background. There are a few different types of meteorites which we commonly see come to Earth. Apart from some which come from the Moon and Mars, most are chondrites. So chondrites or chondritic stony meteorites are basically sedimentary rocks. So they are kind of all the dust that was in the planetary nebula as the solar system was forming, that kind of stuck together to form these rocks. Sometimes they've been altered through heating a bit. Sometimes they've had water go through them, so they've been aqueously altered, but they're very primitive materials. When enough of this stuff has stuck together, we start to form planetary bodies. So asteroids, planets, moons. And if they get big enough, you end up getting heating and differentiation of these bodies. And this is when you start to form things like the crust, the mantle, and the core. Most iron meteorites that fall to Earth are these big solid chunks of basically pure iron with some other metal phases in there. And we think that they came from the core of these planetary bodies. We also have others that are metal with olivine in them called pallasites, and these come from what we think is the core mantle boundary. And we have examples of material that looks kind of volcanic or breccias and stuff, which we think are from these planetary crusts. So basically, we would have had one of these bodies early in the solar system, and it got broken apart through impacts, and this material came to Earth as meteorites. The 2E iron meteorites, however, are a bit different. So, as I said, most iron meteorites are formed in cores. However, the 2E iron meteorites don't show the same chemical signatures of core formation. So these diagrams here show the siderophile elements, so the metal iron-loving elements. And in most iron meteorites, you get these trends as you get fractional crystallization in a core and you get fractionation of these elements. However, with the 2Es, they cluster, they don't have these trends. And this is telling us that we didn't have this slow cooling of a big pool of metal in a core. Another really interesting thing about them is that they contain silicates. So if you remember back to that first overview slide, we had some iron meteorites which had olivine, which we think came from the core mantle boundary, so these pallasites. However, tuis are really different. They contain a range of silicate inclusions. So on the far left here, you can see a meteorite called Nyetsheva, and that contains these angular clasts, and these are actually chondritic, so those kind of sedimentary conglomerate type materials, as these angular, heated up, altered a bit clasts. We also then get clasts like in the middle here. This is the Miles meteorite, and they contain minerals which we kind of expect to see more in the crust. So we found potassium feldspar, silica, phosphates, as well as lots of pyroxenes, not much olivine though. Then we also even get these ones that you can see on the far right that contain these glasses. So these really glassy inclusions, and they're really high in silica as well as sodium and potassium. So the big question is, how did these meteorites form? So we have material, which we kind of understand usually forms in the core, so metal, and we have material that's in a crust. But these are intimately mixed in these meteorites. Also, the silicates have, different shapes and different compositions. So that's the big question. And there's a few hypotheses of formation that have been put out there. So the main ones are, first of all, impact events. So either you have stuff that's formed in a core somewhere and stuff that's formed in a crust, and they have been in two different asteroids and they've impacted and they've mixed together. Another possibility is that you had a body which is still mostly chondritic, and you impact it and you melt it, and these phases start to separate out. Another option is that was first proposed was extreme planetary differentiation. So kind of at the early stage of forming a planet that has a core and a mantle and a crust, you get pockets where you get metal and silicates forming, but not all of it has melted. And you start to see this kind of extreme examples of planetary differentiation within an overall chondritic body. And a final hypothesis that's been proposed is subsolidus nebular condensation and metasomatism. So this is very different. This is not involving planetary bodies at all. This is where from the big nebula that was dust and gas that our solar system formed out of, we had condensation of these phases and kind of crystals of silicates that metal then kind of condensed from this nebula and encased. So to answer this question, I mostly looked at the Miles 2E iron meteorite. So it is by volume 80% iron nickel metal with about 20% of these silicates. So in the picture on the left, you can see the silvery color is all the metal, and it's made up of lots of small grains with silicates as the dark material. And within those silicates, there's also phosphates and oxides. It doesn't have a Whitman-Staton pattern. Now, a Whitman-Staton pattern is a pattern in the metal that forms when a meteorite cools, or iron metal, sorry, cools very slowly in a core environment. Because it doesn't have this pattern, we know that it cooled quite quickly. And so it didn't form in a core. One of the things we did is we did a CT scan. So I'm just going to play this little video I've made. So this is a small piece of the meteorite. And what I've done is I've taken away the metal so that we can kind of see into it. The silicate inclusions are in the brown, and the grayish white ribbon-like features are actually the grain boundaries of the metal phases. And you can see that there's interconnection between the phases, that the silicates kind of sit in the junctions of these metal grains. You also get features like lobate phosphates. So you might be able to see there is kind of spherical blob-like features that stick out off the edge of these silicate inclusions, and these are phosphates. Other things, important features that we discovered while looking at the Mars 2EI meteorite is that they have cuspate margins, the edges of these silicate inclusions. And this is really important. This tells us they're not angular, so it's not like a xenolith that's been included. These crystallized when you both had molten metal and molten silicate next to each other. We also found a phase called disordered Sri-Lankite, and when it's disordered, we know that this only occurs when it cools rapidly through 1160 degrees Celsius. So we know it was really hot at one point and it cooled quite quickly. We also found some phases that tell us about how much oxygen was available, so how reducing the environment is. And we found that it's 1.5 to 2 log units below the iron Wolstite buffer, which means it's very reducing. We also found tridymite. So tridymite forms at high temperatures and low pressures. So this wasn't, deep in a planetary body. This is a surface level feature. When we look at the inclusions in more depth, we can group the inclusions into 3 types. So intermediate inclusions, which contain pyroxene. So they were mostly enstatite and augite, as well as albite. Felsic inclusions, which contained pyroxenes, albite, as well as potassium feldspar. And very felsic inclusions, which were almost purely albite, potassium feldspar, tridymite, and had a lot of accessory phases like zirconolite and bedelliite. They also all contained phosphates to varying degrees. When we plot up the average composition of these inclusions, we see some patterns emerging. So if we normalize it to a H chondrite, so this is just one of the types of chondrite, so that primitive material. If we normalize it to that composition to see how it compares, see how it differs from, an original starting material of the solar system, we see this pattern, and this is the same pattern that people have found when they do partial melting experiments of this same material. And this tells us that this material is likely, each inclusion is likely to be representative of a little pocket of partial melt of a chondritic material that has experienced varying degrees of melting. So, high temperatures with a high melt fraction resulting in less variation from the chondrite the original material, whereas a small amount of heating with a low melt fraction, you get these very highly silicic, lots of potassium rich inclusions. We also dated these meteorites because this really tells us where they kind of fit into our understanding of solar system evolution. So there has been dating before using various methods of this group. So these are the ages that people have found for the whole suite of silicate minerals in these meteorites. And we used 2 types of dating. We used lead-lead dating on the Sri-Lankite mineral, and we were able to get an age of 4.542 plus or minus billion years, plus or minus 4 million years. And we were able to get such a precise date because it had very low common lead. Now, this is 25 million years after the solar system formed. And this is actually quite late in solar system evolution. So a lot of stuff happened very quickly when we had a lot of highly radioactive elements decaying, and there was a lot of heat and there was a lot of collisions. So this is when the solar system's starting to settle down a bit. We also did argon-argon dating, and in our results, we got 2 partial plateaus. We got one at about 4.3 billion years and one at 3.5 billion years. These dates align with dates that other people have found for the 2E ions, and in the previous to our work, people found that they were either around this 4.5 billion, so this old age group, or around 3.6 billion, this young age group, but not both. However, we were able to get within the same mineral both ages. So it looks like this group was all probably formed at around 4.5 billion years, but there was something that happened at 3.5 that reset the ages of some of these meteorites. And for the miles, it resulted in these partial plateaus on the argon spectra. So when we're thinking of which hypothesis is right, the petrogenetic model has to explain this huge range of features. So we have really different silicate inclusions, and we have some 2Es that don't have silicate inclusions at all. We have a range of peak temperatures. So as I said, we found that miles formed above 1160 degrees Celsius, whereas other people have found that some others form at a bit lower temperatures, around 920 to 1080. We also have these two age groups, and we have a huge range of cooling rates. So we have some which do have the Whitman-Statten pattern. So the picture above Arlington, the middle picture, that has a Whitman-Statten pattern there. And this showed that it cooled quite slowly, whereas some cooled, so around 1 degree Celsius per million years, whereas some cooled at rates above 2.5 degrees Celsius per hour. So that's a really big range of cooling rates. So if we revisit our hypotheses, so we have, thanks, Alanis, we have impact events. It's probably not, oh dear, there we go. It's probably not mixing of differentiated materials. So if you remember right back to the start, we don't see these signatures of differentiation in the metal. So we can kind of rule that out straight away. We can rule out extreme planetary differentiation because buoyancy constraints, you know, metal's very heavy, silicate's very light. They wouldn't stay together in the same way that we see here. We can also rule out subsolidus nebular condensation metasomatism. This hypothesis, it doesn't really explain how you get so much metal and proportions, as well as glasses, as well as crystalline material and chondritic material all mixed together. So we're left with melted chondritic materials. So the hypothesis which we suggest is that around 4.54 billion years ago, a porous planetary body, so probably chondritic, was impacted. And this led to melting in like discrete lenses and dikes. When these melts formed, they immediately began to cool. So ones near the surface cooled very quickly because heat was able to escape out to the vacuum, but those buried beneath were kind of insulated by all the regolith, and they would have cooled slowly. And then at 3.5 billion years ago, the body was impacted again. So this is an overall view of the impact structure which we imagine. So it could be either a complex or simple crater. We have these melt lenses, dikes as the heavy metal flows down, and this leads to the range of features we see. So inclusions which include partial melts, as well as metal that kind of entrains chondritic material as angular clasts, as xenoliths in a way, pieces without metal, without silicate, metal, as well as those with a high amount of silicates. And yeah, so that's what we've come up with. Questions?
Amazing. Thank you so much, Rachel. Does anyone have any questions from the audience?
I have a question, if I can just yell it out. Is that okay?
Yeah, go for it.
Cool. That was such a great talk, and what a great piece of research as well. It's really exciting. It's very cool. So I don't work on meteorites, but I have done work on migmatites here on Earth. And so it was really cool for me to see the beautiful textures that you showed with the cuspate boundaries and things like that. But I was wondering, I always wonder about meteorites, like what differences you might expect when there's zero gravity. So I was wondering if there are any melt textures that that are different in meteorites because there's zero gravity, or any that you don't see that you would see on Earth rocks?
Yeah, well, there is different. We do have to take that into account, but there's not zero gravity. So these are still planetary bodies. They're smaller. There's a lot less gravity, but, you know, it's not completely dust flowing everywhere. It's still kind of held together in these circular-ish bodies, spherical-ish bodies. We do have to take that into consideration. So part of this research, I did do some physical modelling to look at how quickly the metal and silicate will separate, and that is a function of gravity and a function of how far it is from the center of the middle of the body. So yeah, we do actually have to take that into account. So if it was a very small body, you know, they can kind of just stay together. These things which are very different density, you know, metal is almost 8 grams per cubic centimeter compared to these kind of granitic inclusions, whereas on a larger body, they separate really quickly.
Awesome, thank you.
We have a question in the chat, Rachel,
Yeah.
from Tani. Just wondering how these meteorites are classified as 2IE ions when some don't have similar properties, e.g. silicate inclusions, and should they be classified differently to typical iron meteorites?
Yeah, so that really relates back to this. So the way that we classify iron meteorite groups is based on their chemistry. So we don't really, it used to be a little bit based on their textures and stuff because we couldn't do the chemical analysis. But now that we can do this chemical analysis, we group them based on these siderophile elements. And that's what these images are. So those other fields are when a meteorite falls in one of those groups, that's where it sits. We also know from things like oxygen isotopes in the silicates that they all are very similar. But you're right, the textures are all really different. So it is down to the chemistry as to know that they are in the same group. And I guess they are different to the other groups because they do show this non-fractionation. They have these weird inclusions. And that's how we know that they are different. There's one other group that also kind of has weird silicate inclusions and doesn't show this fractionation. But generally, most we think formed in a core.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Rachel. There's another question in the chat, which I'm sure you can just answer by typing that in. But we are going to move on to our next speaker. So our next speaker is Charlotte Pizer from the Victorian University of Wellington. Today she will be talking about hunting for earthquake evidence on the, I'm going to pronounce this terribly, Hikurangi subduction margin. Thank you.
Can I just check that you can see my screen okay?
Yep, looks great.
Awesome, and you can't see those Zoom controls, eh?
No.
Awesome. Okay, so thank you for that introduction. Today I'll tell you a little bit about my PhD research that looks at earthquake evidence along the Hikurangi subduction margin. So I'd just like to say as well, it's a pleasure to talk alongside such a diverse science audience today. It's really cool. So diving at the deep end, subduction zones, as we're from such a diverse background, we'll just go over that quickly. So subduction zones are where one tectonic plate subducts beneath the other plate. And the point at which these two plates interact is the interface, and strain can build up between these two plates that's suddenly released in a big earthquake. Now, subduction zones are located all over the world, particularly around the Pacific Rim of Fire, as you can see in the image. And why should we care about them? Well, it also happens that subduction zones have hosted the largest magnitude earthquakes and tsunamis that have ever been recorded. So really big and scary things. What's perhaps more concerning is these events that we've been able to measure. So the recent events have constantly shown that our understanding of subduction earthquakes is really quite limited. So what we know about them is constantly evolving. And most of what we know comes from these areas that have had these modern events, whereas some subduction zones haven't had them. This is just an example from the Tohoku earthquake in 2011 that caused such widespread destruction. So why should we care? Well, it just so happens that just off the shore of New Zealand, we have a subduction zone. So the Hikurangi subduction zone lies just off the east coast of the North Island and subducts beneath the North Island across the Marlborough Fault system and transitions into the Alpine Fault. So New Zealand is also one of these places that hasn't experienced a large magnitude subduction earthquake within historic times. So it's really important that we gather all of the knowledge that we can to try and figure out how and what the characteristics of these earthquakes might be when they do happen. So what do we know so far? So this figure kind of draws on the modern observations of seismic behavior along the Hikurangi subduction margin. So the red kind of hatched area shows the locations in which the subduction interface is accumulating strain, so where it's becoming stuck, and therefore where we expect these big earthquakes are most likely to happen. So as you can see, the southern section of the Hikurangi subduction margin is where we think it should host large earthquakes based on these strain measurements. And lo and behold, we have this evidence of prehistoric earthquakes occurring from the Marlborough region. So that's 4 large magnitude subduction earthquakes in the last 2,000 years. So that is all kind of making sense. As we look further north, though, along the margin, we have this more weakly coupled or less locked section on the central section of the subduction margin. Here, the seismic behavior that we've been able to observe is much more low magnitude, so things like slow slip events and aseismic creep. So the modern behavior and what we would expect to see is kind of stacking up until we factor in that there is also paleoseismic, so prehistoric evidence of large magnitude earthquakes occurring in this region as well. So this leaves us with some questions that if we don't think large magnitude earthquakes should happen on this weakly coupled section, what is causing this signature of the vertical deformation associated with big earthquakes? So a little more detail on that record that we've got from the central margin. It comes from Ahuriri Lagoon, which is just north of Napier in Hawke's Bay, and it shows evidence of 8 subsidence events in the last 10,000 years. So the land going down by about 1 meter to 2 meters repeatedly over the Holocene. The issue with the Ahuriri record is the age distributions for these events is actually quite big. So we're not too certain on when these happened. The Ahuriri record is also really complicated, which casts some doubt over the earthquake ages and the earthquake evidence, because there's a lot of cores that are kind of compiled to make this record. Something else that's particularly troubling is there is also earthquake evidence from just 15 kilometers north of Ahuriri, but this evidence doesn't show earthquake ages that are similar to Ahuriri. Now, these sites are so close together that regardless of the fault source that may be causing the signals of deformation, they should be recording the same earthquakes. So if they are different, then we've either got a problem with the dating of the earthquake evidence at one or both of the sites, or there's something not quite right with the evidence that we're using to formulate this record of subduction earthquakes on the central margin. So this leaves us with a heap of questions, such as how can the central margin host these earthquakes? Are they even subduction earthquakes that we're looking at evidence of here? And regardless of the source, what is the recurrence of these events so that we can better prepare for ones that may occur in the future? So where do I come in? Well, my PhD looks at going back to the Pakuratahi Valley to create more precise earthquake ages from the evidence there that we can then use to compare to earthquake evidence along the margin to find out the spatial extent of this earthquake evidence and therefore whether they might more likely be subduction earthquakes or something else. Alongside this, I'm trying to create an earthquake record from offshore. And just like we have cores from onshore that contain earthquake evidence, we have cores from offshore that contain evidence of ground shaking during large earthquakes that preserve these event deposits that we can date and then relate to the onshore evidence. So taking you to the Pakuratahi Valley now. Now, this whole area, as well as Ahuriri, was actually uplifted by around 2 meters in 1931 by an earthquake in the upper plate just north of Napier. So it's just context of the area there. So when we went to Pakuratahi, we did lots of coring to obtain these sediment cores, but we were also faced with these massive outcrops and drainage ditches, which allowed us to get up close and personal with the earthquake evidence. And these are present across the field site, so it was a really cool place to be working. So for a bit of context of what I'm actually talking about, this earthquake evidence, what we look for is evidence of these sudden changes in the land. So things like a forest, which is above sea level, in coastal regions then changing to suddenly below sea level. So this indicates that the land level has rapidly changed, probably during an earthquake. And we know that this happens really fast based on the sharpness of the contact between these two different environmental units. So it's something really rapid and really fast. What we also have at Pakuratahi is this thick tephra deposit, so this volcanic ash that we can use to link all of the cores and outcrops together. So yeah, as I said, this rapid land level change would indicate subsidence, so the land going down, and the inverse is also true, so sea level changing to signify uplift of the land during earthquakes as well. So we use this evidence from different areas in the valley to build a story of the sequence of events. So we have the land going up here and down again, up here, the volcanic eruption, and yeah, so we try and pin all these things together using just our observations of the sediment types, but also microfossils, so these tiny fossils that we can gain the environmental information from to make inferences about the different types of environments that they would have been living in. So as I said, we use this tephra, this volcanic ash, to tie all of these event sequences together. And we come up with this kind of overall picture of what's happening in the valley. So we have the tephra deposit here that's linking everything together. This goes to offshore of Hawke's Bay, so the coast. And we have this sequence of subsidence, uplift, the tephra tying it all together, subsidence again, and subsidence again, and then uplift in the 1931 earthquake. So that's kind of an overall picture of what we're dealing with below the surface. So once we know that these earthquakes are happening and we can pinpoint where they are within the stratigraphic record, we can use radiocarbon dating to get an age on them. Now for this, we sample through the core, either side of the earthquake horizon, isolate tiny macrofossils such as seeds and leaves that are short-lived, send them to the Magic Radiocarbon Lab that produce ages for us. We then stack these ages within an age model, which uses the distribution of each individual age within a model to constrain the age of each event that we want to pull out. So we have the uplift event in blue and the age of the tephra here in pink. And we do this for each earthquake. So as a preliminary kind of insight into my results so far, my new Pakuratahi ages are at the bottom of this figure. And as you can see, they are starting to line up a bit better with the original Ahuriri record. But something that is striking is definitely the more earthquakes that still occur in the Ahuriri record that aren't reflected at Pakuratahi. Now, this is still worrying because it either points to a huge issue with the preservation potential of Pakuratahi, so we're missing earthquakes, or that they are overrepresented at Ahuriri. So this is something that is still really important to get a handle on and hasn't necessarily been able to be pulled out from my research. But one thing that we have been able to tease out at the moment, which is really cool, is this evidence of uplift as well as subsidence. So just like the 1931 earthquake that uplifted the land, we also see evidence of this happening previously. And something that has been completely apparent is that this earthquake record on the central margin generally is complicated by such large magnitude upper plate earthquakes as well as subduction earthquakes. So teasing out this subduction earthquake record is really, really complicated. So can offshore help with this? Well, this is still definitely a work in progress, but as I said, we can tease some things out at this stage, particularly using this sequence around the Waimahia tephra. So that evidence that we saw onshore is also preserved in the offshore cores. So here's onshore sites and the offshore sites here in green. And these are CT scans of our offshore cores. And what we can see is the event beds, which are these sharp-based event beds here. And just above it sits the Waimahia tephra. So just as we see onshore is the uplift event or the earthquake causing the uplift of the land shortly before the deposition of the Waimahia tephra around 3,500 years ago. So this is something that is only one event, but it's been really cool to see that we can definitely link these recordings of earthquakes onshore to the event deposits being preserved offshore. So although, yeah, this is only one example, it does give us confidence that we will be able to tie these two different earthquake records together in the future. And this is just an image of me painstakingly sampling the offshore cores to get the radiocarbon samples out. So what we'll do after this, or what I have been doing for the last year or so, is producing, as we do onshore, a sequence of these ages for each core that we can then link together. So the road towards entanglement is definitely muddy. It involves a lot of cross comparison and correlation. So correlating those offshore event deposits between each cores, correlating the offshore and onshore deposits together to see where we have these earthquakes occurring in both records that may help us get a handle on the location and the magnitude of these events, and therefore how that might help us differentiate between the sources of the earthquake. So whether they are these upper plate fault earthquakes that we don't necessarily or haven't necessarily considered as sources of these large magnitude deformation signals onshore, or whether they are indeed subduction earthquakes. So I guess that's kind of a quick, I feel like I rushed through that summary of my research, and just a few thank yous there, but I'm happy to take any questions.
Amazing. Thank you so much, Charlotte. That was incredible. Looks like Mel has another question.
Yes, I do. And hopefully, well, not hopefully, but probably this is the question you always get asked, which is, what is there anything else that can cause rapid changes in sea level that you have to rule out as like a base assumption of your work, or like is there anything else that can cause the juxtaposition of those two different units next to each other that you have to rule out?
Yeah, definitely. There's a wide range of processes that could cause the juxtaposition, as you say, in those paleo environments. But most of them would cause more of a gradual change. So things like sea level fall or sea level rise, you're right, would cause that just juxtaposition of environments. But there would be a transition period between those that would be quite distinctly different from such a sudden change as you have with the co-seismic deformation with earthquakes.
Cool, thanks.
I was going to ask a question just related to that one, Charlotte. Just wondering, like, in terms of, so we do know that sea level rise can be really short and really sharp, you know, in the sort of century timescale at sort of extreme climatic periods. So I was just wondering, like, how tightly constrained your dates are across those sort of lithologic boundaries, and is that helping you rule out something like, you know, a rapid sea level centennial change?
Yeah, well, I still think with centennial change you would see a period of transition, but the earthquake, and we don't necessarily have any evidence of that from the sea level records that we have around the region. I don't think that's particularly prominent within the time frame that we're looking at, but the resolution of the earthquake ages that we're dealing with are, I think, mostly like plus or minus 20 years or 20 to 70 years maybe, so they're pretty short. And that might seem big to a lot of people, but that's really quite specific in terms of comparing it to the paleo earthquake, the resolution of paleo earthquake ages up and down the margin, because everything is just so hard to date. So it's a particular merit of this site that we've been able to get those really precise earthquake ages.
Do we have time for another question?
Yep, go for it.
Do you see evidence of like massive amounts of erosion of some of your beds to lose, you know, some of these chunks of time? And can you tell when you actually do have, you know, instead of that gradual change, how do you know that the gradual change evidence hasn't eroded away and you just have like peat on top?
That's a really important point. So it's actually something that we've been dealing with, and it's why these things like the tephra isochrons are so important, because they are definitive points where you can tie the sequences together. So for instance, our most recent earthquake that's around 1,000 years ago, we think may be associated with tsunami deposition. So in one core it has a really coarse deposit either side of the earthquake boundary, and in others it doesn't. And that boundary sits just on top of this tephra that is 1,800 years old, but the sediment within the deposit is 1,100 years old. So from that, we know it's different, but we would also interpret that it's different based on how erosional that lower contact is. So it's looking for things in the structures of the cores, but then backing them up with the dates as well to be sure that we are looking at an unconformity, because it's definitely likely that evidence could have been eroded, and maybe that would forgive some of the disparity in those two earthquake records.
Amazing. Wow, thank you so much, Charlotte. It was beautifully explained as well. I really enjoyed how you laid out your methods. It was very easy
thank
to follow.
you. It didn't feel like it to me.
All right, we're going to move on now to our final speaker, which is PhD student Neethu Madhukumar from James Cook University. And Neethu will be talking about artificial intelligence for weather forecasting. Welcome, Neethu.
Thank you, Alanis. Yep.
All right, I can see your screen. Oh, yep, there we go. Looks good.
All right, thank you. So thank you all for coming to my presentation. I'm Neethu Madhukumar. I'm a PhD student at James Cook University, and I'm part of the Internet of Things research group. Today, I'll be talking about artificial intelligence for weather forecasting. And this talk is on my research about using AI for improving some of the existing weather forecasting techniques. So this slide gives an overview of my presentation. First, I'll be talking about the background, motivation, then my model, which is called Hybrid Climate Learning Model, and the results and the conclusions which are drawn from these results. So what is artificial intelligence? So artificial intelligence is a technique that enables machine to mimic some of the behavior of humans. So how can you achieve this? So you can achieve this using machine learning algorithms and a set of data. Deep learning is a branch of machine learning which is inspired by human brain. So this structure is called artificial neural networks. So I'll be touch basing on some of the basic artificial neural networks so that the audience will be able to follow some of my works later on. So a perceptron is the name given to an artificial neuron. So it is kind of like the neuron in our brain. So what happens here is like you have a neuron, which during the training, we give a set of inputs, which it checks how much of it was positively impacted to provide the right output. So if this X1 has provided more positively to predict the output Y correctly, then the neural network would assign more weight to this decision or this input. So in your brain, you don't have just one neuron. You have multiple neurons forming a network. This is called a multi-layer perceptron, where you have a layer or lot of neurons. Basically, the network has an input layer, a hidden layer, and an output layer. And some of other decisions which we take is like we see some objects, the vision, and some decisions are taken by the brain using the visual input which we perceive. So such information can be analyzed using another network called convolutional neural network. Then there are other type of information which similar to we perceive, like time series, like or sequences, like our speech. We will be thinking, okay, if she says red, what will be the next word which she'll be using, like red top, red blouse, or red flower, or something like time. Yesterday there was rain when there was a lot of cloud. So today, will there be rain, seeing that the cloud is like this? It is like something which is a sequence, which is time related. For such type of problems, you should ideally use a recurrent neural network. So I'll be using some of the features of these neural networks to tackle the existing problems in weather forecasting. So official weather forecast is provided by the meteorological department. So if you are planning for, let's say, a tour, you will be taking your phone and you will be looking at the weather forecast, maybe some days ahead. So basically, if you look until the last day, you will be getting a forecast for your target day of travel. This is because the meteorological department provides multiple forecasts over the time. So ideally, you will expect that the last forecast, that is which was provided one day before, will be the most accurate forecast. So this assumption we found from existing studies is not true. Okay, so this is actually a study which uses from Brazil. So they use an ETA model, which is a climate model for predicting weather forecast. Here, the green line is the rain gauge, which measured the actual rainfall, and the blue line is the model predicted forecast. The 24-hour before is the latest forecast, and the 264-hour before is the oldest forecast. So now let's just zoom in and see. You can see that compared to the 24-hour forecast, there are other days in which the forecasts are like moving more closer to each other, indicating that there were better forecasts on earlier times. A similar pattern was observed in the Bureau of Meteorology Australia forecast. So here in the remaining sections, the forecast one, which I'll be using, is the older forecast, which was produced 7 days before, while forecast 7 is the latest forecast. So for an example, on this particular day, forecast 7 predicted that there is 6.4 mm of rainfall, while forecast 1 predicted there is 0.9 mm of rainfall, but actually there was only 0.6 mm of rainfall, indicating that the latest forecast was not actually the best forecast. To analyze this further, so we cannot make a decision based on a day that, okay, this weather forecasting system is not working. So we had to analyze it much deeper. So we and took a data of a year and we analyzed what was the accuracy of each forecast. So we found forecast 7, which is the latest forecast. We found that it is only good for 2 months compared to the earlier forecast. And also with the earlier forecast, you can see that there is still a lot of error. So if we can further improve on this best forecast, you can actually improve the weather forecast further. So motivated by these things, we checked at how we can improve these forecasts. So official forecasts are provided using climate models. And existing studies indicated that deep learning models actually has the capability to refine the outputs of the climate model. And my target was to predict short-term forecast because I am actually using the rainfall forecast for irrigation purposes. So short-term forecasts are more important for my particular research. And it showed that using a probability-based approach would help in assessing the reliability of forecast. So however, compared to this research, my research had to assess the reliability of multiple forecasts. So what neural network will be more suitable for such an application? So I already told you what is a multi-layer perceptron, and these studies indicated that they applied multi-layer perceptron on finding the best input from a set of 18 data sets which had similar features than as rainfall. And we found that the multi-layer perceptron was able to find the best from the set of inputs compared to many traditional approaches. So here, zooming in on this particular one, if you provide a set of inputs, which is x1 to xt, it is provided to the hidden layer. The hidden layer will calculate the error in predicting and use this error to find the weights, and the weights are used via softmax function. Softmax function is a probability function which is generated using the weights calculated by the neural network and the inputs to calculate the probability of each forecast. And using an argmax function, we can choose which is the best forecast among the set of input forecasts based on the softmax function. However, as I already said, the best forecast still needs refining. And this is a time series problem because brain is a time series thing. Yeah. So existing literature illustrated that LSTM network, which is a kind of recurrent network, which I said was good for analyzing time series data, has a potential for a time series weather problem. So zooming in, you can see that an LSTM inside has a lot of cells. So there is like a time series information, which is provided to an LSTM, each cell at each time instant. So inside an LSTM cell, there are 3 gates, so which controls the flow of information. So one is the input gate, one is the output gate, and the forget gate. The forget gate controls which information needs to be passed on to the next cell for predicting future predictions. So to the basic LSTM, I made some changes so that it is suitable to my particular task. So some of the common features of rainfall were taken into consideration while modifying the basic LSTM network. One is rainfall is a rapidly changing input. So for such type of input, it was found for similar data set, an approximation layer can help track these changes better. And some of the rainfall is related to its temporal neighboring features like temperature, wind, etc. So a fully connected DNN layer can help in better input abstraction. So like you have a better abstraction of input, you have like better perception of what is going to happen, and then the neural network can make a better decisions. So this is my proposed hybrid climate learning. And this work has been published in the IEEE Internet of Things journal. So the climate model multiple forecast and the observations are taken as input, and they will be refined using a neural network to get a better rainfall forecast. So an MLP is used, and using the softmax function, the conditional probability is derived and the best forecast is selected. To further refine the best forecast, the climate model observation data is provided along with the forecast to a fully connected DNN network for better input abstraction. And an approximation layer was provided so that the model can track the rapidly changing rainfall data to provide the rainfall prediction as output. For this study, I used the open access BOM datasets, the 7 forecast as well as the corresponding days observations. The proposed model was compared with the best of BOM forecast, the basic LSTM model, and 2 related works. These related works were chosen because the first one, it was shown that was able to perform better than the BOM forecast. However, they used the latest forecast, but they did not check it against the best BOM forecast. Second one was a GRU model. GRU is also similar to LSTM, a recurrent neural network. Both of them have shown like good performance in different tasks. So we wanted to check which was more suitable for analyzing a rainfall data. So these 2 related works were chosen for comparison as well. The experiments were conducted across 6 major climate zones in Australia for 12 months. So these tests were conducted across these 10 locations. And first, using the root mean square error, the prediction error was calculated. So I'll just zoom in on one of the results so that you can see it more closely. So here, the best of BOM forecast is the red line, and the HCLM line is the blue area curve. So you can see that the HCLM compared to the other models was able to better predict with a lesser error in this proposed test site. Similar test results were observed in other 10 stations as well. To further analyze this, one of the main critical problem when I apply for irrigation is the high rainfall events, which leads to miscalculation in the amount of water which needs to be irrigated. So for that purpose, we actually tested the model's ability to predict high rainfall events. And to zoom in on one of the results, you can see that the blue line is the real high rainfall event, and the proposed model, which is the HCLM, which is the red line, was able to predict it more closer compared to the other model. Similar results were also the more correlated was our proposed model compared to the other results. And on an average, the overall model was able to enhance its performance compared to other deep learning methods which were applied in similar applications. So in conclusion, the a hybrid learning model was developed for rainfall predictions. It was able to predict rainfall similar compared to the actual rainfall. Higher correlation and lower error was observed, and it was also able to predict extreme rainfall more accurately. So these are the references which I have used in this presentation. And that's all from me. And I hope that I was able to provide some insights on how artificial intelligence can be used for better predictions. Thank you.
Wow, thank you so much, Neethu. That's incredible. I love how you can combine forecasting and observations to make these amazing models. Does anyone have any questions?
I have a question. Thank you. That was really interesting, and it blew my mind that an older forecast could be more accurate than the most recent one. So it was really cool at the end how you showed that different places in Australia had sort of different accuracies in the forecast. And so I was wondering what made it easier or harder to predict rainfall in different places around Australia or around the world. Is it the amount of rainfall or something else?
I think so what you wanted to know is what kind of inputs contributed more in a better predictions across Australia as well as across different zones. Is that what you wanted to know?
More, maybe it was more what, when the Bureau of Meteorology has an inaccurate forecast, that seemed to be, is that location dependent around Australia? Is it less accurate in some places compared to others? And why is that the case?
So I think one of the main thing I found in my research was the type of climate that particular location has. So for example, if you look at some locations, because of the climate type, they have quite random and high rainfall events. For example, if you look at New South Wales at the moment, there is it's quite big rainfalls are happening. It's flooding and everything. The climate is quite unpredictable. So for such locations, I think the model is finding it more hard due to the randomness and unpredictability of the rainfall. While if you look at Melbourne, you don't see such events like flooding and such events. So it's more, I would say, easier for the model to predict the rainfall events at Melbourne compared to New South Wales. All right.
Cool, thank you. Does anyone have any other questions? If not, I've got one. Because I know in your work, because I've read some of your work before, and I know that the implications of your work is for farmers so that they know when to irrigate. So how will your work be? How will farmers be able to use your work, and is that available to them, or will it become available to them?
So at the moment, so we have a team in JCU, a research group, which is working with the farmers in Northern Queensland. So some of our systems are actually in the testing phases with them. but it is not like commercially available at the moment. So on your question, how my work will be important for them. So it was actually because we have a system called IrrigWeb. So if you want, you can check it online, which provides support to the farmers in taking irrigation decisions, like how much water needs to be applied on the next day. So it is basically calculated using also taking into consideration how much rainfall will be available next day. So if you over irrigate, what happens is, like in the sand, there will not be much oxygen left, and it will kind of be like you're suffocating the plant. So it will die out. While if you don't provide enough water, the amount of water is less, it will go into stress. So if it goes into stress, the output products like the fruits and vegetables, the quality will not be that good. So the amount of water is very important. So by getting an accurate forecast amount, you can actually calculate how much water needs to be given to the plant. So I also, I only showed a part of my research. I'm also researching on my other, because it's like still in the publication phases. So that's why I did not present it. So that is like the soil moisture. That is also important, because after rain falls into the ground, how much effective rainfall you have for the plant, you can calculate from the soil moisture. So yeah, so by getting those amount of water actually available to the plant and what can be available, you will get a better calculation of how much water need to be irrigated.
Great, amazing.
Okay, thank you.
Your work is really important, and it will be exciting to see what you do in the future.
Thank you.
So thank you so much for everyone for coming along today to help support our PhD students. And most importantly, I would like to thank our speakers, Rachel, Charlotte, and Neethu, for all teaching us about your super interesting topics. It looks like Charlotte's had an outfit change, which is great. Just a reminder that there's one more workshop this month for Postgraduate July, which will be held next week on Wednesday at 1 p.m. And thank you so much for everyone coming along. This seminar will be posted online, so just check out our socials and you will find it. Thank you.